Patrick, I was reading about why you decided to write this book, and I read a comment that you shared where you said everything being made in China was the Achilles heel of that company. That company, of course, being Apple. So take me back to that moment.
So in the summer of 2022, I'd been reporting on Apple for the Financial Times for about 3 years. And I was beginning to look like I was drinking the Kool-Aid coming from Cupertino because I got really bullish about their prospects. And now that's fine for a couple of stories. I wrote about how 9 out of 10 American teenagers prefer iPhone. And, the implications of that are when they go off to college, they're probably going to buy AirPods and MacBooks. And I just thought, their sales are going to have a steady accretion over the next few years. But that's not a great place to be as a reporter, right? You don't want to just be like singing the tune that the company you're following is singing. And so I began to ask the opposite question, which is if this rosy scenario that I'm imagining does not turn out, what will be the reason that prohibits it, right? And so I, for the first time, really started asking questions about where everything and how everything was produced. And, all roads lead through China a lot more than I had understood, even though I, like anybody else, had seen the box or the back of the old iPhones that said they were assembled in China. And I just began to investigate, and I couldn't believe how much I was learning and how much hadn't been written about what I consider now to be, the biggest untold story in tech for the last 25 years.
I also read that you did more than 200 interviews during this process, talking to former executives and engineers. As you were doing that reporting and researching and writing the book, did it really just reinforce what you were initially thinking about this incredible story that needed to be told?
I figured out the contours of the story pretty early and was able to, write a 70-page pitch on what I was going to go find. But then the details that I found, I mean, completely upended certain narratives that I had. And, one thing I would say is when I started the research, I really thought I was going to spend 3 to 4 months diligently going after as many people with Apple experience as I could. And when that inevitably failed, I was going to switch tack and start trailing the story through suppliers like Pegatron and Foxconn and so forth. Plan A never failed. I just knocked it out of the park on how many people from Apple I was able to speak to. And the 200 figure, that's only counting the Apple people. I also spoke with suppliers and such. But it almost underrepresents the sourcing I was able to get because it's not the number, it's the caliber of role that these people held, either in seniority or how like deep in the weeds on the ground they were in China.
So I would assume, as someone who has covered the tech industry for 2 decades, that people were a little bit reluctant to speak because having done press events where Apple is managing everything, they have pretty tight control over who says what. So did you have that same experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my hit rate in terms of who responds when I reach out is very low, but I reached out to thousands of people. So even with a low hit rate, it was a numbers game. And that's how I was able to speak to enough people. And then once you form relationships with people, you'd say, who are the top 5 people that you could either, reach out to on my behalf or confidentially reach out to and have them speak to me. So there was that. The other thing is that a lot of people in Apple, and it's not just former employees, by the way, it's current ones as well. A lot of people are unhappy with how much they've consolidated into China and the strategy that took them there. I mean, the number of people that would have made those decisions are just the higher echelons, right? But the engineers and even the executives that were going over to China, they didn't make that call and they were uncomfortable with that call. And I wanted to tell the stories of the people who thought there could have been a different path and they were uncomfortable about the consolidation into China. So, people weren't just disgruntled employees or anything. These are people that had the time of their life working for Apple, but the decisions to be in China were above their pay grade, and they were happy to tell their story because they think change is needed at the company.
Of course, we're going to talk more about China, but I also want to talk for a second about India because we do hear this story over and over again that Apple is starting more and more to actually assemble products in India. So, what are some of the stats there?
So Apple wants you to talk about it more and more. And the reason they want to is because China knows that it's not really a true story. So there's no risk there. But if you think it's a true story, then it's fantastic for Apple's PR and it certainly avoids the tariffs. But to put it simplistic, a bit. If there's 1,000 steps to making an iPhone and the final one is now being done in India, hooray, you've avoided tariffs. It's now made in India. Have you de-risked your supply chain whatsoever? Absolutely not. So Amber, if you're able to buy an iPhone next year and the box says made in India, it will be no less no less dependent on the China-centric supply chain than any other iPhone you've ever purchased.
So this is such a unique time to be putting out this book because presumably you would not have known a couple of years ago what was going on in terms of the tariffs that we're seeing today. I'm always a bit reluctant to talk about tariffs because it is sort of this moving situation that is constantly evolving. But I think it's important to talk a little bit about the situation with the tariff wars that we are faced with today. So how is that impacting what's happening?
Well, so Apple began making iPhones in India in 2017, and that was also about tariffs. It wasn't about Trump's tariffs, it was about Narendra Modi's tariffs. So India was building a middle class, growing 8% a year, and Apple, looking geographically for where's our next growth region, really centered on this country of a billion plus people with a growing middle class. Problem was Modi, or New Delhi, you could say, put something like 20, 22% tariffs on smartphones coming from China. So there was a real push within India to have phones made in India. And so Apple began shifting then. Now, the more recent sort of acceleration, if you will, of the assembly is less about Modi's tariffs and more about Trump's tariffs. So if Trump is putting, or at least threatening, 125%, 145% tariffs on China, then of course what you want to do is sort of reroute the shipments so that they're coming from India. Now, you can't sort of just reroute them. You sort of can't have India as a pit stop, but India is sort of becoming the closest thing to that, where basically the sub-assembly and all the components and everything are really all going through China, but then they're going to India for sort of one final step where the sub-assemblies are put together and then put in a box that says made in India. So I think there's far less going on, or far less that meets the eye in India than Apple would like you to believe. But if they're to move wholesale from China, we're talking about something that isn't made, an announcement for next year. We're talking about a 15 to 20-year effort with totally unpredictable consequences as to how Beijing would react, how Chinese consumers react, and with no certainty or guarantee that it would even work out. I mean, China is just leagues ahead of anybody else when it comes to the depth and breadth of of advanced electronics industry. And I wish I was more optimistic about India, but I'm really not. And I don't think Apple's actually making gargantuan investments despite their statements to the contrary.
What kind of disruption is this causing within Apple? And especially if we think about Tim Cook, who's had really, I think, a very flattering persona out there in the public. What is this doing to Apple and their image?
Well, amongst Tim Cook's goals, and among Tim Cook's attributes is he's really a statesman as much as he is a CEO. And that's because Apple is so big that the actions that it takes in other countries literally have geopolitical consequences. That's not the case for most other corporate CEOs. And so he's being put in a role here where he is sort of having to please and placate both Xi Jinping in China as well as Donald Trump in Washington. And what's really interesting is that insofar as Apple is a bargaining chip between those superpowers, it's Beijing's bargaining chip, not Washington's. And that's an astonishing state of affairs. I mean, I call Apple the world's greatest company, but in terms of who has the leverage over its day-to-day operations, it's inarguably Beijing, not Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I can use President Trump's language, China holds the cards here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So why should the average consumer care about this story?
Great question. I think they should care because, and this is the thesis of the book. So sorry, I guess I have to back up just a little bit. The gist of my argument, it's really not even an argument so much as a demonstration of what happened over the last 30 years, is that in the 1980s, when you moved from a company like IBM outsourcing to a company like SCI or Selectron, and of course later Foxconn, there's a technology transfer that takes place where IBM would have to teach these contract manufacturers how to build something. And at the time, it wasn't a big deal because it was just a company-to-company transaction, a company-to-company transition. Once China joins the World Trade Organization in 2001, and Western corporations are all engendering this sort of technology transfer, it becomes country to country, where our industry is actually sort of being hollowed out, and we're deindustrializing, and we're relying on China to make up for that and to sort of come up with the shop floor innovations. Now, that's sort of all right insofar as China is an ally and we're all going to inculcate the world's biggest democracy, and small L liberal values are going to build a middle class in China, and then you're going to sort of overthrow the communist power. I mean, that was sort of the American consensus in the late 1990s, early 2000s. You might remember something like the Golden Arches theory of diplomacy. This is Thomas Friedman saying, no two countries that have McDonald's have ever gone to war. Well, things really take a different turn when Xi Jinping takes office in late 2012, basically sees Apple as an exploitative power that is giving back to the country. And Apple suddenly has to sort of learn to speak the local language and convince Beijing of all the things that it is doing for the Chinese supply chain. And so Apple internally hires senior people to actually live in China for the first time between 2013 and 2014. These people call themselves the Gang of Eight. They're sort of running everything that's happening in China, and they're playing the eyes and ears of Cupertino, if you will, on the ground in China. And what they realize is that Apple is investing a whopping $55 billion a year in China. That doesn't even include the cost of components, so-called bill of materials within an iPhone. This is just the labor cost of having up to 3 million people in your supply chain just working on Apple products. This is the training cost of those workers, their wages, billions of dollars worth in machinery that Apple would install in suppliers' factories to allow them to work on products at a scale, at a quality, at a quantity that they couldn't do without Apple. And so Apple begins to realize, oh, there's a really big political play here where we can convince Beijing we are giving back. We might not have any joint ventures in the country, which is the thing Beijing has been pushing for decades, but we are having an enormous impact on quote unquote indigenous innovation in China. And that's sort of the essence of the narrative. So why do consumers care? Well, if you think the US-China tech war is a really big deal, it's disconcerting to say the least that America's greatest company is playing for the other side.
Well, there's a lot to unpack just in that statement because
400 pages worth.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fascinating too. I mean, as you were writing this book and as you look at what's happening today in terms of essentially this war, if I can call it that, do you think there's any good solution to all of this?
So if there was a quick and easy solution, or even a long-term obvious solution, my book wouldn't be very compelling, because the point of the book is to point out that Apple is really stuck here. So if there was some easy solution, then I wouldn't have such a stark conclusion. Nevertheless, it's a really fair question, and I would absolutely want to see Apple making enormous investments in India, because India is an ally. It would build resilience in their supply chain. And if you understand the technology transfer embedded or engendered in the way Apple operates, then it would actually do a lot for India. I'm not even sure New Delhi understands just what an asset it is to have Apple production in the country. The thing that people don't get about Apple is they are not just relying on component makers to sort of continually upgrade and they use the newest components and build the next iPhone. They are sending literal plane loads of engineers from California into hundreds of factories across China, and this could be India, of course, and they are inventing the processes, the manufacturing behind the next parts and components. And so that's where the investments are so significant. And so if you are disconcerted by the idea that China has become an absolutely electronics manufacturing juggernaut, well, then you should support the idea that they should be doing this in a more allied country like India. Now, the Republican fantasy is that you would do this in America, and we can get into why that's really just a fantasy. I mean, America doesn't have the density of population, the dynamism of the population, and certainly doesn't have the wages, the determined work ethic, any number of things. India is the only country that at least has the potential, because there's more than 1 billion people there. I'm still pretty bearish that it can happen, but with enough investment and understanding of what I call the Apple squeeze, which is we're not going to pay you much, but you're going to learn a hell of a lot from us. If that were taking place more in India and less in China, that would be great. But to sort of preempt your next question, because it's going to be the obvious thing, oh gosh, now I'm losing my train of thought here. It would be, well, what would Beijing do if Apple is to start doing this in India? And of course, Beijing has, no reason to want to lose any of this manufacturing. So the more real depth and breadth of manufacturing that Apple moves to America, if you want to say, to Mexico, to India, the more that Beijing could really exercise some of its power. maybe just in the basic sense of raw materials stop arriving at the factory on time. There's roadblocks. Apple's dealt with this stuff in the past, by the way. Maybe electricity at certain key factories goes out for a few hours, right? They can just do a lot to sort of send a message that we're not happy with whatever it is you just announced in, your latest earnings about moving to India. So in other words, my sort of ideal scenario is politically extremely problematic. So you probably need Beijing at the negotiating table here. But going back to quote you, quoting Trump, Beijing has the cards here, not Apple, and certainly not the US. And so it's a bit of a quagmire, and it's a quagmire of their own making to some degree.
Absolutely. And if you think about the past couple of years or few years, really, and you think about the future, I wonder if this is going to be a situation where it is such a massive priority and distraction that it impacts innovation at Apple.
I mean, I would almost say I hope it impacts innovation. Like what I mean by that is, most journalists covering Apple, product reviewers, whatever, they think the next big thing after the iPhone is what Apple should be focused on. And I think absolutely not. If Tim Cook were to retire tomorrow and the new CEO came on board, that person's biggest project is to build resiliency into the supply chain and de-risk from China, far more than making sure the iPhone 20 in a few years down the road has, 5 cameras instead of 3 and, double the memory or whatever. I mean, I just think this is existential. New product features are nice. They're icing on the cake. But the cake is in China. Probably the metaphor doesn't go over that well. But I just think it's so much more consequential that they can build their products and not be so dependent on China than to say that the next product is great. And, the other reason why the consumer should care, Jon Stewart had a show on Apple TV Plus. Well, what happened to it? He wanted to do an episode on China. Executive said, no thanks. And he gave them the middle finger and he went back to the Daily Show. So the more that Apple is moving into services, the more it really matters. I mean, you're not going to have a cyber thriller on Apple TV Plus where the Chinese person ends up being the villain. I mean, it's just politically taboo. It's never going to happen. And I don't know that we want to live in a society where we're facing those kinds of restrictions. And so as Apple pushes more into services and content and answering your queries with AI, I mean, is Siri ever going to tell you what happened in Tiananmen Square? I don't think so.
Nor will DeepSeek.
Exactly, but ChatGPT will. It absolutely will. And so the China problem, the China dependency, actually does have a material impact on Apple's ambitions in artificial intelligence. Even if you're in the US or Canada, that doesn't matter. If Apple is sort of on the record through Siri describing that communist Beijing is an authoritarian power or something, that is a big no-no. So they will give you that answer, but it is distinctly not Siri giving you that answer, right? They're outsourcing that to either ChatGPT or to Google, but it's a big no-no for Apple to answer that question or any number of questions directly.
So you've been covering Apple for a while, and obviously in writing this book all about Apple in China, you, of course, would see things and know things that maybe the rest of us aren't exposed to. And I want to talk specifically about Tim Cook. Do you think he's ready for this challenge?
So let me say something nice about Tim Cook before I take it in an opposite direction. When in 2022, Apple became worth a $3 trillion company, and that was the first time that had ever happened, the value of Apple on average since 2011, when he took over, had risen by $700 million per day. I mean, that is such a mind-bogglingly large increase that I thought I had the math wrong and I had to do it 6 ways to Sunday. And then people still thought it was wrong on social media. They did their math their own way and they realized I was right. We don't know as humans, like just how big a billion is, how big a trillion is. I mean, the numbers that Apple does, shipments in, the money it makes, and so forth, it's just incomprehensibly large. I mean, I remember talking to an Apple engineer who was trying to teach his kid this, and he said, if you were just to count 1 per second all the way up to a billion, it would take you 32 years. And Apple rakes in $1 billion of revenue per day. I mean, it's really hard to get your mind over just how large and successful this company is. So I will give Tim Cook credit that if you're looking at this from a shareholder perspective, a sort of shareholder first capitalist perspective, Tim Cook is something like a demigod, right? However, he's also the person most responsible for wedding Apple's fortunes to China. And insofar as I think there needs to be a radical untying of that knot or a retying of the knot so that you've got 2 knots, a bifurcated supply chain, one in India with some other nations involved and one in China, I don't think you can have the CEO who's wedded to the current strategy pulling that off. It's a 15-year effort if it can be done at all. I think you need someone 15 years younger than Tim Cook to take that on. So I would effectively be calling for Tim Cook's ouster, but with a golden parachute. Give the guy another $1 billion and a fancy plaque, but someone else needs to come in and see the strategy to the finish line.
It feels to me that Apple is almost untouchable in terms of its persona, right? You know, you see all of these other tech companies that are constantly under the microscope and a lot of attention being paid to them. When I ask you the question about the impact on consumers, I'd also be curious, do you think that consumers will read your book, start to learn more information about Apple's relationship with China, and potentially cause any type of backlash, knowing that I'm not saying Apple people are cult-like because I use Apple products, but they certainly have influence?
I think cult like is fair, and I might even say I'm in that cult. I mean, I wrote this book, and I'm speaking to you on a MacBook Pro. I have different headphones in, but I own AirPods and Apple Watch and all that. In fact, people find it really funny, but I wrote the entire book in the Notes app, which maybe it's the first book ever written in the Notes app. I don't know, underrated app. End-to-end encrypted. I mean, there's all sorts of great attributes about that app. So I'm not anti-Apple, and my message certainly is not that you need to cut off Apple. I could absolutely see someone coming to that conclusion, but I'm not an activist in any sense. I'm not sort of trying to cause, consumer backlash against Apple whatsoever. And I'm sure, based on the title of the company of the book, particularly the subtitle, there will be a perception that maybe the book is anti-Apple. And I think, in a sense, you'll be in for a bit of a rude awakening, because the first chapters in particular are all about the genius moves that Apple did to really come out of the 1996 crisis, bringing back Steve Jobs and engineering the greatest corporate turnaround ever. And even if the persons aren't always named, but many of them are, I mean, you're rooting for Apple because it's all these geniuses that they've hired that are making all these moves. So it's sort of like a pro rah rah go Apple book until they sleepwalk into this geopolitical crisis and they sort of realize, oh, we're in way over our head in China. Nobody senior living in the country in 2012, and they need to radically change that. But that was the moment where, instead of deciding, how can we placate Beijing and sort of be on their side and make sure that there are not obstacles to us producing and selling products here? I think they should have not given so much money to shareholders through buybacks and dividends. I think they should have been building supply chain resiliency. And had they been doing that the last 12, 13 years, I think they'd be in a far better position than they are right now. So Apple's financially the most successful company ever. I think geopolitically, they're in a very precarious situation.
Absolutely. Well, I have so many more questions for you, but I feel like people should definitely just read the book and learn on their own about the situation. And, again, I think a lot of people maybe are just totally unaware of the challenges that are ahead for Apple. So just remind people where they can get the book, the title, when it's available.
So, I mean, your Canadian audience I'm hoping it becomes a Heather's pick, right? It's certainly at Indigo. It's going to be, I imagine, at all the Canadian shops. In the US, it's definitely at Barnes and Noble. It's on Amazon. It's on Amazon.ca, Target. I think you can basically buy it wherever good books are sold. I'll say the audiobook version is narrated by Fred Sanders. I sort of hand selected him. He's my favorite narrator, and he does an excellent job. So I should be no problem actually finding the book. And I think if you just read the opening paragraph, I mean, I try to hook you right away. There's no sort of like, here's how I got interested in Apple or anything. It just, you're in the middle of a narrative right away, and then it's just like really fast paced, even though I take you through 3 decades. And I take you to places that you just don't know anything. I mean, you might know Apple really well. I bet you have no idea that the Tangerine Blueberry iMacs were being made in the Czech Republic, in Wales, in Mexicali. You probably don't know that the first iPods were made in Taiwan, not China. You probably don't know what the sewing machine repair shop is, which is an entire chapter. You probably have never heard of the yellow cows. That's my favorite chapter of the book. I mean, the amount of new material in this book is tremendous. And it's not because I'm brilliant. It's because I took an approach to looking at their manufacturing, looking at the geopolitics, and talking to some of the smartest people who have ever worked at Apple. And they were telling me their narratives and had just never talked to journalists before. My job was just to sort of actually, in a certain sense, do what Apple does in China, just pull it all together and package it, right? But all the sort of hard work was really being done by the people who live this narrative. I just had to tell their stories.
Well, a reminder to people, the book is called Apple in China by Patrick McGee.